I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, that everything that has happened to me here has helped to spread the good news. For everyone here, including all the soldiers in the palace guard, know that I am in chains because of Christ. And because of my imprisonment, many of the Christians here have gained confidence and become more bold in telling others about Christ. Some are preaching out of jealousy and rivalry, but others preach about Christ with pure motives. They preach because they love me, for they know the Lord brought me here to defend the good news. Those others do not have pure motives as they preach about Christ. They preach with selfish ambition, not sincerely intending to make my chains more painful to me. But whether or not their motives are pure, the fact remains that the message about Christ is being preached. So I rejoice, and I will continue to rejoice, for I know that as you pray for me and as the Spirit of Jesus Christ helps me, this will all turn out for my deliverance. Have you ever said, life's not fair? A poet once complained to a friend, life's not fair. A banker can write a bad poem and nobody says anything about it. But if a poet writes a bad check, everybody gets upset. For those of you who don't know what a check is, ask your mum and dad. When my kids used to complain about not getting their share of cake or lollies, if I was in a grumpy mood, I would respond with a line from The Lion King by Disney, life's not fair. There are times when we feel that way. Something happens to us and we say, it really isn't fair. Why is this happening to me? We seem to be stuck in the same job. We try out for a new job. We don't get it. Our health declines. Our friends maybe move away. Maybe we have difficulty with family relationships, even when we feel like we've done the right things. And we say, this isn't fair. Why is this happening to me? There was a time when the Apostle Paul looked back at what had happened to him, and looking back over the past several years of his life, he too could have been tempted to say, look, this isn't fair. Why is this happening to me? Indeed, why wouldn't Paul feel like life is unfair? Let me tell you some things about his life. He's in Jerusalem and he's worshipping with his friends at the temple. And some Jews are there who hate him. And they start false rumors about him, and they drag Paul out of the sanctuary and begin to beat him up in the courtyard. They intend to beat him to death. The Roman commander, who's responsible for keeping order, rushes in with some of his soldiers, and he sees Paul bloodied and battered and assumes that Paul has done something wrong to inflame the crowd. So he arrests him on the spot. Then he tries to find out what's been going on. And the crowd all contradict one another and say something different. And the commander realizes he's going to have to get some clear answers. So he takes Paul to the prison barracks and he decides that he'll have his own men interrogate him. Now, the method of interrogation was to tie the prisoner's arms between two posts and give him the whip until his tongue loosened and he told them what they wanted to know. And as they're stretching Paul's arms out, Paul looks at the soldier in charge and says, is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen, someone who hasn't been found guilty of anything? Paul knows it isn't legal. If someone had Roman citizenship, he was protected from such abuse. And if the soldiers flogged him without a trial and a verdict, they would all be court-martialed and put in prison themselves. And the soldier in charge kind of turns white and tells the others to stop what they're doing right away. And he runs to the commander and tells him that Paul is a Roman citizen. Now the commander's worried too, and he's arrested a Roman citizen without any real charge against him, and he needs to get a specific charge if he's going to protect his own career. So the next day he gathers the Jewish leaders of the city and brings Paul into the room and asks them, what's the problem you have with this guy? Again, they can't agree. In fact, they start arguing with each other concerning what Paul is guilty of. The commander gets frustrated and sends them away and puts Paul back in the prison. That night, the commander gets word that some of the Jews have a secret plot to kill Paul. 40 men have vowed that they won't eat or drink until they've killed him. And their plan is for the Jewish leaders to request another meeting with the commander the next day on the pretext that they finally have the information he wants. And then as Paul is being transported to the meeting, they intend to kill him. Realizing that he has a situation on his hand that he can't control as a Roman soldier, and it's too explosive to handle. The commander sends Paul off in the dead of night, protected by 500 men, and he sends him off to the coastal city of Caesarea, about 50 miles away. Caesarea is where his boss is headquartered, the Roman governor Felix. So we then go to Caesarea. The commander sends along a letter to the Roman governor that goes like this. To His Excellency, Governor Felix, greetings. This man was about to be killed by the Jews when I rescued him. I love the spin there. He's a Roman citizen. When I attempted to find out the problem, all I could do was get a lot of religious talk. They didn't seem to have any real criminal charge against him that would merit punishment or death. When I found out they intended to kill him anyway, I thought it best to send him to you. I've ordered his accusers to present their case to you. Several days later, the accusers arrive in Caesarea, and even after more meetings, this time before Felix, still nothing is determined. But during the proceedings, Felix begins to realize that this man is not an ordinary Roman citizen. He defends himself well against the accusations, and he seems to have a lot of friends on the outside. And Felix begins to think maybe some of these friends would be willing to pay some money to grease the wheels for Paul's release. And he keeps Paul in custody for 2 whole years, hoping there's a bribe in it somewhere for him. Now, the thought could have occurred to Paul, this isn't fair, why is this happening to me? I mean, life isn't fair. I love the story of the conjurer, the magician, and his career was ruined because of a talkative parrot who gave all his tricks away. All the time, the parrot would be sitting on his shoulder and would give the trick away. He would go, it's up his sleeve, or it's behind his back, or there's a hidden panel. And this parrot was really ruining his career. But eventually, this magician, got a job, a different job. This time, it was on a ship. The ship was the Titanic. He couldn't bear to be away from this talkative parrot. It went everywhere with him, and so it went on to the ship as he performed his act and still did the same thing, gave the game away, this talkative parrot. But of course the boat sinks, and he's floating in the water there, floating on driftwood with the parrot still on his shoulder. And the parrot is totally silent. For 2 hours this parrot is totally silent, saying nothing. Finally the parrot says, all right, I give up. Where's the ship? Life's not fair sometimes, is it? Let's think about Paul. He's 2 years in custody. And what happens then is a new governor comes to replace Felix. The Jewish leaders try again to get Paul convicted of something, and they appear in force before the new governor, this time agreeing on some charges against Paul that they hope will stick. The trouble is they can't offer any proof of their charges, and the new governor thinks that perhaps if he sets up a trial in the city of Jerusalem where the events happened, he'll be closer to the scene, and maybe he'll find more reliable witnesses and evidence. So he asks Paul, are you willing to go to Jerusalem, where we can settle this thing once and for all? But Paul, of course, knows that if he goes back to Jerusalem, he'll never make it out alive. They'll find a way to kill him. So he plays the last card available to him as a Roman citizen. He appeals to Caesar. He claims his right as a Roman citizen to have his case put before Caesar himself, which is kind of like putting it before the High Court. And the governor has to grant him this request. So off he goes. He gets sent over the Mediterranean and he arrives on the island of Malta. Within a few months, Paul and some other prisoners are put on a ship and sent off to Rome. Several days out, rough water hits and slows their progress. And for days the wind is against them and they make no headway at all. And by now they're heading into the start of winter season when sailing is dangerous. And Paul has a sense from the Lord that if they keep going, they'll meet disaster. And he urges them to put into the nearest harbour and wait for spring. But the 3 leaders in charge of the ship don't want to do that. And the owner of the ship wants to get his merchandise to Rome and make his profit. The Roman commander wants to turn his prisoners over to Rome and be rid of the responsibility. And the pilot of the ship, suddenly seeing that they have a few hours of a gentle breeze, agrees that it's safe to continue. However, after a couple more days, that gentle breeze turns into a hurricane, and now the ship is absolutely helpless against its force. And driven without control, the ship crashes into rocks near an island and breaks apart. And the soldiers get ready to kill all the prisoners so that none of them can escape. But the commander thinks of Paul and stops them. He orders those who can swim to head for the island and those who can't to grab a plank or some other piece of debris so that hopefully the tide will push them to shore. Now, amazingly, everyone makes it to shore and they spend the winter on the island. And when the spring comes, another ship takes them on to Rome. So he's been shipwrecked now. He's going through the wars, is Paul. Paul has still not been officially charged with anything, so the government allows him to rent a small house, and still he has to be chained to a guard for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, to ensure he doesn't disappear until his case comes before Caesar. Now, the Roman courts move slowly, and Paul passes another 2 years under house arrest in Rome. He is able to receive visitors in the house, but the chains never leave his wrist. Every 6 hours, a new Roman guard takes over. Have you ever been chained to an evangelist? Paul can't move unless the guard moves with him. And when he sleeps, he has to arrange himself so that the chains don't get under his head or his body. And even though he has no source of income, he still has to pay rent on the house or he'll be put in a dungeon. And for 2 years this goes on, and the future is still very uncertain. Paul isn't sure what will happen, and when he finally does appear before Caesar, he's not sure whether he's going to get a fair trial or not. He might listen to the Jewish accusations and think, well, if one man's death will make them happy and keep the peace in that volatile country, then no big deal. Paul knew that Jerusalem would have been the end of him, but for all he knows, the same thing could happen in Rome too. And the thought could very easily have occurred to him, this isn't fair. Why is this happening to me? I came across this story recently in the Twitterverse. A guy called Keno was walking in Thailand in 1988 with his brother. And they were walking amongst the ancient temples of Ayutthaya. And he came upon this monk and he thought to himself, this is a rare opportunity to learn something substantive from someone who's made great sacrifices. And so he decided to ask, well, what's it like to be a monk? And after a long silence, this monk turned to them and said, it sucks. But for Paul, that isn't the thought that occurs to him, despite everything that's happened to him. During the 2 years of house arrest in Rome, a totally different thought has come into his mind, a thought that brings a great grin to his face, that makes him happy. And he wants to tell his dear friends from Philippi, who have just sent him some more money so he can afford to rent a house, he wants to tell them all about it. From the very beginning, they've been his partners in the gospel, and he's so proud of them. And he prays for them, he's got love for them, and he wants to thank them for their latest gift. So he says, I want you to know this though, amongst everything that's happened to me, and because of all that's happened, I still rejoice. And in this letter, the word rejoice and joy occurs many, many times. This is a letter from prison, because Paul is asking a different question. I think the Bible is less interested in the why of suffering, and it's more interested in us entering into the story of redemption through and within suffering, and seeing God's purposes in the world, no matter what the suffering involves. But that's really hard to come to terms with when everything in our thinking, in the way we've been trained, in the way our culture has discipled us, as it were, in the way our emotions are, and our worldview is screaming, why me? But Paul's worldview is very different perhaps to ours. His question is not, is what's happening to me fair? It's, is what's happening to me accomplishing something for God? Is it furthering God's purposes in the world? Now, that doesn't always occur, of course, or isn't always obvious, but that's his go-to point for Paul. And as he looks over the past 5 years of his life with the mob beatings, the unjust imprisonment, the shipwreck, and now the round-the-clock chains, his concern is not, is it fair, but is it accomplishing anything for God? And he tells us about that in Philippians chapter 1. You know, we can't always see the outcome, but Paul in that passage could, because he saw little bit glimpses, things happening that were serving the purposes of God. So he says in verse 12, I want you to know that what has happened to me has advanced the good news. Contrary to what you'd expect of me being in prison, it hasn't hurt the good news, it's actually helped the progress of it. It's accomplished something for God. And if you ask Paul, is it fair? He'd say, no. Has it been fun? Absolutely not. Has it been enjoyable? No. Is it something you would have chosen for your life? Of course not. But in the midst of it all, he stopped and asked himself, is it accomplishing something for God? And when he saw that the answer was yes, that mattered more to him than his personal convenience or the fairness of his situation. What has happened to him is something that advances the kingdom of God right into the very corridors of power in Rome. You see, you and I probably come from a worldview that makes us the center of attention. God so loved me that he gave his only son. Or we take promises from the Old Testament. I will bless you, Abraham. I will make your name great. I will make you a great nation. And we read those kind of promises or those kind of words for ourselves. I am the center of God's universe. No, you are not. And nor am I. God is the center of the universe, is at the heart of all things, is the object of most importance. God so loved the world is not about me. It's about God, his love for the world. It's about God's mission to the world. The promises to Abraham to make him a great nation were so that that nation would bless the other nations. God doesn't bless us with new life in order to bless us, but to be a blessing to others, to embark with him on his mission to the world. And that was Paul's perspective. He wasn't the center. God's mission and purposes are the center. So he says, look, while the gospel has put me in chains, the gospel is not chained. It's furthered God's work, me being in chains, in a couple of ways. Firstly, because of what's happened, people are being won to the Lord. Significant people, influential people, people who in the future can have a great impact. Because of what's happened, they're being drawn closer. They're seeing the good reputation of the good news. And in Paul's case, the significant people that are being won are the palace guards who are chained to him. And they're there 24/7. They cannot get away from this evangelist. Now, according to verses 12 to 13, people are hearing the gospel and believing on Jesus. The whole palace guard is learning about Jesus one by one as they're chained to him. And this palace guard would be a hand-picked military group. They were the personal bodyguard of Caesar himself. Strong, courageous, brilliant, sophisticated, well-trained, typically young men. Kind of a mixture of top military academy officers and the Secret Service. And they served in the palace guard for 12 years, protecting Caesar and guarding Roman prisoners that had appealed to Caesar. And after 12 years, they transitioned into other influential careers in the civil service, in other parts of Roman society. Some went on to be commanders and generals. Others went into public office. Others went into the top echelons of business and industry. This is a group who are going to be the future movers and shakers, the opinion leaders, and indeed the kingmakers of the next generation. They were powerful. They were a strategic group of young men. If you wanted to influence the Roman Empire, it's a good group to start with. And every day Paul smiles, oh, who's coming to be chained to me this week? Is it going to be a future leader? It's an evangelist's dream job. During the early months, the guards assumed Paul was like other prisoners, guilty of some crime like leading a political revolt or embezzling huge sums of money, or illegally profiting from some disaster. But as they got to know him and as they listened in on the conversations he had with his friends, it wasn't long until it became clear that he was in chains because of someone called Christ. And over the months, as the soldiers' rotations kept coming around and they put on the chain, he would talk to them. And the conversations might have gone something like this. Marcus, it's good to see you again. It's been several days. How's Claudia, your wife? Last time you were concerned because she'd been running a fever for 2 weeks and getting weaker, and the doctors didn't know why. I prayed for her, Marcus. I asked God to heal her. How is she? Oh, she's well now. That's good. I'm glad for you. Oh, you're welcome, Marcus. I think God has you especially in mind. Remember last time you asked me why the death of Christ was so important? And you can imagine the conversations going on. Maybe in talking about the death of Christ, Paul would talk about how the guards themselves were there to lay down their lives for Caesar. And maybe that was a parallel that he was able to draw with them. We certainly see elements of his circumstances in the letter itself. And we can guess at some of the conversations he might have had. And so it would go on, guard after guard chained to Paul, listening to the story of Jesus. So what happened to Paul? His chains rippled throughout the whole palace guard. You could call it a chain reaction. Right, grandpa joke there. He had a captive audience. Paul, yeah, that's another joke as well, yeah. Paul recognizes the situation for what it is. Because of what's happened to him, people are being won for the Lord. Is it possible that what happens to us might be God's way of accomplishing something for himself? Maybe something we don't see. But do we actually have eyes maybe to look and to see? Maybe there are things that are happening through us and in us by being a loving, a kind, good neighbor that actually go over and above and beyond what we think it's all about. And God is doing something remarkable. Perhaps your difficulty in conceiving of what God might be doing might be actually your problem. That actually God is still at work and is still sovereign and is still doing stuff. Or maybe you can spot some things and keep your eyes open for it, even in the midst of suffering. I don't wish to diminish any of the pain of suffering, but to get us thinking in new ways about our lives. What is of ultimate importance? The more worshippers around the throne, for me at the end of time, the better. Because it's all about Jesus. That's Paul's sole raison d'etre, as it were. That's what drives him. The question is not, is what's happening to me fair? But instead, is it accomplishing stuff for God? Is it furthering God's purposes in the world? Is it bringing glory to Jesus? And when we see that it is, as Paul is able to in this passage, we're able to say, it's all about you, Lord. And it's not about me or my reputation or my ministry or me being popular. And he sees the good things that are going on around him and he's encouraged, and he seeks to encourage other leaders in the church while he's in chains. He says in verse 14 that other leaders in the church see Paul's courage and they heard the reports about his impact on the palace guard, of how significant people were responding to the gospel, and it led them to speak out more boldly and fearlessly, to hold more public meetings. Now there were reprobate characters as well with mixed motives in the church who also preached, but they did it not out of pure motives, and they did it to give Paul a hard time and to stick it to Paul a bit. Oh, they're preaching a good message, of course. They wanted people to accept Christ, but it was kind of a way to stick it to Paul. But at the same time, Paul goes, you know what? Jesus is being preached. I don't care. You see, for these guys, Paul was getting too much attention. As far as they were concerned, he was just a little too famous. The big shot apostle who came to town. And some of the local pastors were perhaps a little bit envious that he was getting all that attention, given that he was not from Rome and he was not a sophisticate from Rome. So some of them take advantage of the situation so that they would become more prominent. It was kind of a rivalry, if you like. And they secretly hoped that as the attention shifted to them, the big star would get his comeuppance. Then he could see what it was like to have someone else praised while he was stuck in chains. He'll see us out there growing big churches, holding big rallies, etc., while he can't go further than this short chain. Now, Paul knew this was going on, but he didn't really care. He makes it clear that what matters to him is Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. He's been put there to defend the gospel. He's going to do that. And there's a phrase there in verse 14, put put there, which is a military term indicating a military assignment or orders. In other words, that's his role. God's assigned to me this role to be here to witness to the palace guard and appear before Caesar. But he's aware that there are others with mixed motivations. And he knew their preaching was partly motivated by envy, by rivalry, by ambition. But you know what? No ego here. Jesus is being proclaimed. I don't mind. What matters is whether God is accomplishing something for himself. So what do we conclude from all this? God doesn't promise that your circumstances will be fair, but he does promise that maybe there will be something in them that will serve Christ's purposes. Something that you may or may not see. There will always be a word to speak, a kindness to offer, a prayer to lift up for other people. And if done when in a state of hardship or difficulty of suffering, how much more will the Lord add to that giving of yourself because of what you're going through? There will always be something for Christ in your circumstances, so look for it. And what happens to us, like Paul, we can say can serve to advance the gospel. And the joy of life comes when we can honestly say, it's not about me, Lord. It's only about you. It's all about you, Lord. May that be your perspective, your worldview, and increasingly the way you see the world. Life's not fair, but God came to make even the unfairness, within the unfairness, through the unfairness, redeemable and rewardable. In this life perhaps, but certainly beyond. Paul points us to that, even if you read on in the passage as he looks to the future, not sure what his life expectancy will be, but he trusts that the Lord is doing a work through him. Amen.